Hello everyone! In this video you will see how I transform an old garden shed into a great summer house for relaxation. 3 years ago, I already cleared this area, and back then I said that the shed would become part of the workshop. Last year I made a new roof and decided that the shed would become a utility block. But in the end, it was decided that, until the main house is built, it will still become a full-fledged summer house, and after the house is built, it will turn into a guest house. So, at the start of the restoration, I only had bare walls. I bricked up one window because it was unnecessary, and I dismantled all the old windows. Also, on one side I sealed a small hole, left by vandals who once tried to dismantle the house for bricks. The first thing I did after the preparatory work was to treat all the wood with antiseptic to protect it from pests and decay. Next, my friend and I, as having a helper is essential for many tasks, began to sheath the resulting frame. For this we used 12mm OSB. There is no electricity here yet, so a battery-powered tool was a lifesaver for all the work. By the way, links to everything I will be using can be found in the description below the video. The OSB joints did not align with the studs. Therefore, looking ahead, I will say that after we sheathed everything, I installed inserts on the reverse side in these areas, and we secured all the joints separately. It was already quite cold and windy, so the camera refused to work and the battery drained instantly. Because of this, we couldn't film how we were sheathing the cornice. I will just say that we simply made a box out of timber and sheathed it as well. As for the sides of the roof and the front overhang, it was decided to close them with a gable upon completion. On the back side there will be an interesting homemade gutter system. But that's a topic for a separate video. I decided to keep the windows the same size, although I must say that during the work and upon completion, they seemed to mentally ask to be bigger. But here, it's a matter of personal choice. For me, this little house is exclusively for sleeping. During the day I will be spending time on the plot and you won't lure me into the house. Therefore the size of the windows is a minor issue. By this point, I couldn't do without electricity, as I don't have a battery-powered hammer drill. So it was decided to get a generator. I installed it by myself, and to prevent the window from falling during the work, I temporarily nailed 2 boards to the wall surface. Then I inserted the frame, leveled everything, secured it with anchor nails, and installed the sash. All that was left was to remove the supports from the boards and foam everything. By the way, I use frost-resistant foam. I had never done this in such cold weather, so I decided to see how the foam would behave and what the result would be. Spoiler alert, everything was perfect by spring. After the windows, I moved on to the door. I found a used door made of thick sheet metal through an ad. I can't say that this was exactly what I was looking for. I wanted to find something factory made so I wouldn't have to bother with painting later. But I took what was available. The other options were even worse. First I installed the frame. You should always start with the hinge side. Otherwise, if the door is even slightly warped, the panel might spontaneously either close or open, and the installation will be more difficult that way. We installed the hinge side strictly level in 2 planes. Also, at the most crucial moment I couldn't find the keys, so I tightened the anchor bolts with an adjustable wrench. Well, at least it was found. Next, I hung the panel on the hinges, and after closing the door, adjusted the strike side of the frame according to the panel, so that it fit perfectly, and only after that do I secure it with anchors. Only this way will everything be precise and accurate. The door itself is lined with paneling on the inside and, as I understood, is not even insulated, so I will have to deal with that later. And that was the last thing I did before winter set in. In the spring, the next stage began: insulation. Unfortunately, this couldn't be done in the fall because severe frosts hit suddenly and the generator broke down. It was decided to insulate everything with 50mm thick foam board. We cut a quarter off the bottom row. Next we applied foam, and after attaching it to the wall, additionally secured it with insulation dowels, commonly known as mushrooms. While one person was securing the first sheet, the other was already working on the second, so the work progressed twice as fast. Why did I decide to use foam board specifically? Firstly, it's easy to install, and secondly, it has a low thermal conductivity coefficient. For comparison, 5 cm of foam board is equivalent in thermal conductivity to 92 cm of brick, or 50 cm of wood. I think such figures speak for themselves. In winter, I will rarely use this little house, but when I do, it will definitely be warm inside. As for the upper part made of OSB, okay, it's a frame and it will also be filled with insulation. But that will be in another video when I start working on the interior finishing. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss anything. In the highest places we used growing sawhorses that I made last year. If you're interested in how to make those, I'll leave a link in the description below the video. When I finished the roof, I noticed that there was a lot of space left underneath, and it was decided that this was a great opportunity to create a mezzanine floor, where sleeping areas could be comfortably placed. But to ensure it wasn't too dark there, I cut an opening for a window between the OSB studs, framed it with a board, and installed the window itself. There were several options, to extend it to the roof and add another one, and so on. But we decided that this was more than enough. At the same time, I also started working on the interior and already assembled the floor frame for the mezzanine floor. As I mentioned, a separate video will be dedicated to this. And outside, the frame was also covered with OSB. Next, we made the blind area, and I also dedicated a separate full video to this. I'll leave the link in the description. And here we ran into something that should have been considered in advance, but was overlooked due to the rush. The column supporting one of the corners of the entire roof was very weak and was sinking into the ground under the load. It turned out that it wasn't even concreted. We of course planned to replace it, but it should have been done before starting work on the roof. Therefore, since the wall finishing isn't done yet, and it's not too critical, we proceeded with the replacement. To do this, in order to install the new column, we needed to concrete the base. By the way, the column will be made of 3 connected boards. First, we determined the location. It had to be directly under the roof angle. Fortunately, it didn't coincide with the location of the current column, otherwise we would have had to remove it immediately, and the angle would have been left hanging, and that's very bad. Next, we dug a pit, and then drilled a hole with a power auger. Overall, the depth was about 1 meter. We immediately placed reinforcement into this hole and filled it with concrete to prevent it from collapsing, because we needed to divert our attention to other tasks. After that, we made formwork from leftover scraps and completed the concreting. Once the concrete had gained sufficient strength, we continued the work. I marked the concrete, using the roof corners as a level reference, and drove in 4 angles. From the side where I planned to place the new column, I temporarily bent one angle. However, the current column was longer in size, so before installing it, the angle needed to be raised. For this, I made a support from old rafters and 50 boards and began to lift everything using a jack. Next, I laid roofing felt in the seating area as waterproofing and inserted the column into its new place. The only thing left was to gently lower everything into place. Everything turned out perfectly. At the bottom, I bent the angle back to its original position and secured everything. On top, I also secured it with brackets on both sides. The column definitely won't move from its place. Initially, I planned to build a terrace to the left of the house and bring it right up to the door, but it turned out that this was impossible. The height simply did not allow for it. The door was too low, and it was initially unrealistic to install it higher. Restoring an old house like this means you always have to work with what you have. In the case of building from scratch, you can consider all of this from the very beginning. In the end, I decided to concrete this corner to the level with the edge of the blind area. I found boards for the formwork that were exactly the right width. I reinforced the formwork with stakes and made it with a slight slope towards the outer corner, so that during rain all the water would flow outside. Then I covered everything with a layer of gravel. The only exception was the edges, from which I, on the contrary, removed everything, so that they would be entirely made of concrete. If the gravel is filled to the edge, then after removing the formwork it will start to spill out. And to prevent this, the edges will have to be concreted again. After installing the column, there were excess pieces of roofing felt. Of course, they needed to be removed. I trimmed all of this along the contour of the corners. Then we watered the gravel and compacted it. When it was delivered to me, it was still damp, but the hot summer quickly dried it out. And it even started to dust in the wind and during work. And of course, we couldn't do without waterproofing either. Here, I laid down the same roofing felt. The next step was to lay the mesh that was left over from pouring the floor inside the house. By the way, that video has already been released. I will also leave the link in the description. Following my classic economical method, I make supports from stones under the mesh, so that all the reinforcement is not at the bottom, but inside the concrete. And after that, I pour the concrete itself. As soon as everything is poured, I proceed to troweling. I sprinkle everything with cement, moisten it with water, and use a spatula to create an even layer over the entire surface. While the concrete is gaining its strength, we switch to painting the cornice. We will be painting with moisture-resistant rubber paint from Neomid. This is a relatively new product, and I used it for the first time. And looking ahead, I'll say that we were simply delighted with this paint. Not only does it look like chocolate, although we did choose that color, but it also smells very pleasant. Fortunately, there are no small children around. I think they would surely be tempted to try eating it. So if you use this, keep it away from children. But of course, we were delighted not only by its appearance, but also by its coverage. Just one coat and everything is easily, quickly and efficiently painted over. Unfortunately, the camera doesn't capture how pleasing it is to the eye, but the fact that it's now one of our favorites is 100% true. By the way, I've already been asked about its name, rubber. This doesn't mean that it's liquid rubber, which you apply and after drying, you can't tell it apart from regular rubber. No, it's paint. It's simply water resistant and highly elastic. That is, it's suitable for facade work and can stretch a bit, for example, along with the linear expansion of wood. You've probably seen how regular cheap paint cracks on wood. So this one is elastic. It dries very quickly and according to the manufacturer is UV resistant. We will definitely test this. Follow me on Instagram. In a year, I'll show there how this paint looks on the surface. By the way, the paint is tinted right at the factory. I ordered it in this color. This is very convenient. And don't forget to read the instructions before painting. I repeat, rubber does not mean that you can, for example, paint paving tiles with it. It is subject to abrasion under mechanical impact. Tactilely, it feels even soft. Overall, it's quite an unusual but pleasant paint. Finally, we can return directly to the facade itself. You might have thought that I would plaster the foam board, but no. The walls here are very uneven and I want to level them. And I have a more interesting option. For this, I need to make the first marking. Since our insulation is 50 mm, I take 60 from the corner, to have a gap and not drill right at the edge. Next, based on the width of the PP profile, which is 60, the other edge will be at the mark of 120 mm. This means that the center of this profile will be 90 mm from the corner. And this needs to be done from every corner in all directions. This is important. After this, from the first mark, the next ones should be placed no more than 400 mm apart horizontally and 600 mm vertically. The next step is to prepare the straight hanger. Bend not only it but also, sapat, the tabs. Align it exactly in the middle of the mark and trace around it. Next, all that's left is to cut out a piece of foam board. You need to follow the same principle for all the marks on the walls. We attach the brick hanger using dowel nails. Where there was OSB, we use screws. Once the hanger was secured, the piece of foam board needed to be glued in place. For this I used foam adhesive, Beza, and I slightly reduced the size of the insulation so that the gap could also be foamed. Now all that's left is to secure all the hangers in place and foam them immediately. The foam sets quite quickly, and the next day you can start installing the metal profile. If the profile fits tightly against the wall somewhere, the foam can be trimmed, but if it doesn't interfere, it's not necessary to do so. First, the edge profiles need to be installed as they will serve as guides. Initially, I use a laser to mark the hangers, estimating at what depth I will secure the profile, and then I make pencil marks on them to use as a reference. Firstly, the laser line itself might not be visible later due to the sun. Secondly, it can be shifted by a gust of wind. And thirdly, it saves batteries. It's great to be powered from the mains. That's what I do when there's electricity. But here, I got tired of running around and changing batteries. After installing the two outer profiles, we decided to add a middle one to simplify the work. You'll understand why a bit later. Then we stretched the cord from one end to the other. The profiles themselves were secured only on one side so we could adjust the plane as needed. After that, we finally fixed the outer profiles and secured the middle one. As soon as they were ready, we started installing all the others. For this, we removed the cord and used another profile of the same kind instead. This is exactly why the middle beacon was needed. The profile is only 3 meters long, while the walls are about 6. It's difficult to adjust everything precisely using just the cord as it lacks rigidity. That's why I often use this method. The main thing here is to fix the guides in such a way that it doesn't interfere with attaching the hangers later. Thanks to this method, everything can be done quickly and accurately. I also considered using a beam or a slat instead of a metal profile, but the price is the same as for the profile when dry. Plus, wood has curvature and freshly cut from the sawmill, although much cheaper, takes a very long time to dry. Additionally, it needs to be treated with antiseptic, which again incurs costs. And most importantly, wood has significant expansion with temperature and humidity changes. In this case, such issues need to be minimized. In the end, everything turns out precise and even. By the way, the profile should not be made flush with the blind area. This is to ensure that in case of possible ground and blind area movement, the frame does not bend or get damaged. When everything is ready, the protruding parts of the hangers need to be bent so that they no longer interfere. But that's not all. It is essential to make crossbars at the top and bottom, to make this structure more robust, and to have something to attach the starting and finishing profiles to. I made them from the same profile, simply cutting out tabs for attachment. The windows also needed to be framed. In some places I didn't even attach them to hangers, but simply made crossbars. And I attached the short studs to these crossbars. In some places, on the contrary, I first made the studs and then the crossbars. It depended on what was more convenient and sturdier. Now, the corner could be made in several ways. In the end, I chose what seemed to me the simplest and most convenient method. I just made a corner crossbar, similar to a regular one. But for now, such crossbars are only needed at the very bottom part. I will make the rest as I proceed with cladding the facade. I will clad the facade with panels from Alta Profile that mimic Pamir Rocky Stone. I've had them stored since last year, and even from the box, it's clear they weren't kept in a dry place. Many of them got rained on due to the leaking roof, and honestly, I was worried that it might affect their appearance. As it turned out, I worried for nothing. Nothing happened to them, and there were no stains. Their size is 116 by 45 centimeters. They have stiffening ribs and, accordingly, are very rigid. By the way, the manufacturers did a great job by placing a padding between the sheets so they don't scratch each other. So the first thing I do before cladding is take a J-profile, insert the panel into it, place it against the spot, put a piece of OSB underneath as a spacer to get the right gap, and mark along the top edge. The padding is there to create a ventilation gap, allowing air to flow through. Next, I use a level to ensure everything is aligned precisely and evenly. I make these marks at the lowest point. If you've watched the video about the blind area, you should know that mine is two-tiered for specific reasons. But I will still start not with the panel, but with the corners. I chose a different color for the corners, trying to pick something closer to chocolate. It's not very visible on camera, but in reality it's quite close. The factory calls this color Tibet. You should always start from the left corner and proceed from left to right during installation. Here, I also place OSB and determine the size, because on this side the paving is higher, and I want to make everything level, so I'll have to cut it here. Everything is conveniently sawn and cut using an angle grinder with a metal cutting disc. Next, I mark the attachment points and form a sturdy corner from the profile. This corner is attached with self-tapping screws with a press washer, and in doing so, you must ensure to screw the self-tapping screw without tightening it, so that the material can adjust during thermal expansion. The next step is attaching the J-profile. By the way, it can serve as both a starting and finishing profile. But you will see this yourself as the video progresses. It is also secured with self-tapping screws, approximately every 20 centimeters. I should note that the hole for securing is not round, but elongated. This is specifically designed so that when the self-tapping screw is tightened in the middle, the profile can move during expansions. If the length of the profile is insufficient, then it needs to be connected properly. If you simply butt them together, an unsightly gap may form during seasonal expansions. Therefore, you need to slightly trim the backside and fit one into the other. This way, nothing will press against anything, and the expansion of the profile will not affect the appearance. I also immediately secured the right corner, because after installing the last sheet, it would be impossible to screw in the lower tab. After the J profile is in place, I prepare the first panels. First, I trim the left edge to be flush. Second, I adjust it to the correct width. As I mentioned, everything around the perimeter will be at the same level. But generally speaking, with this stone pattern, it's not necessary at all, as it won't be noticeable, unlike, for example, a brick pattern. The trimmed panel fits snugly into the J profile. To install it evenly, it's convenient to use a laser level. Personally, to save on batteries, I pre-marked the lines and made pencil marks on the metal profile. If you look closely, you can see them. Next, you need to pay attention to whether there is an opportunity to secure the panel. I remind you that the self-tapping screw is screwed exactly in the middle of the hole, and it may happen that the hole does not align with the profile, leaving nowhere to screw it in. To solve this problem, it's enough to make a bridge at this spot. I remind you that the panel should not be tightened, otherwise it won't be able to move during expansion when the seasons change. The panels themselves fit into each other with a reliable lock and are assembled quite easily. However, sometimes something might hit the head of a self-tapping screw, and for a while you can't figure out exactly where to finally set the panel in place. But overall, thankfully, there were not many such cases. The last panel in the row can be trimmed to length. For this, first position it as it should stand there. Then, mark it, about 1.5 centimeters less than the maximum size, and cut the panel. During installation, it's better if the corner is fastened with only one self-tapping screw. I've tried different ways. This is the most convenient. The rest can be screwed in after the panel is installed. And so the first row of one wall is ready. The beginning is made. Then it's all the same. Marking, reinforcing the corner, and installing the panel. Only here it's simpler. There's no need to cut the panels by width. The leftover piece of the panel from the previous row always becomes the first in the next one. This minimizes waste. And by the way, after a couple of rows, I switched to attaching the right corner after the last panel, not before. And this greatly simplified the task. The only downside is that one tab, which remains inside, will not be screwed in. But here all the corners overlap each other, so they are perfectly secured even without it. I had to spend a bit more time working on the last left corner. It was necessary to calculate the angle correctly and not cut off anything extra, but in the end everything fit well. After this, it is necessary to reattach the J-profile. If initially it served as the starting profile, now it will serve as the finishing one. Now in my case, each panel of the first row needs to be trimmed at an angle. If the house were cubits with a flat roof, it would have simplified the task. The other walls are done in exactly the same way, although there will be some aspects that differ from what I've already done. More on that a bit later. This wall already had a window, and here I simply cut the panels according to the existing frame. Everything was quite simple. By the way, thinking about saving money, I didn't buy plastic trims but made the slopes with moldings from a cheaper material, and it looked just as cool. I'll show you at the end. I started the two small interior walls near the house door a bit differently. I was critically short of J-profiles. Somehow it turned out that the calculations were wrong, so I had to use a stainless steel starter strip here. The difference from the J-profile is that it is not visible, it is completely hidden behind the panel while still securely fixing it. But here, you can only start with a whole panel. It so happened that the level here was exactly 0, and there was no need to cut the panel. However, the installation here required some effort. There were a lot of small pieces and each needed to be cut. But it's plastic. This did not affect the metal cutting disc at all. There are two options for the internal corner. You can do it with a J-profile, but that leaves very large gaps in places, big enough for a finger to pass through, and I don't like that. That's why I chose the more complicated option, but in my opinion it's more attractive. Here everyone decides according to their own taste. I placed the panel flush and drew parallel lines from the perpendicular wall. All that was left was to cut it all out. The first row on these walls, as you can see, I didn't finish with a J-profile because there wasn't enough of it. After separating it for the unfinished walls, only a small piece was left, so I'll leave it until I buy more, which won't be difficult. On this wall, I didn't know how everything would turn out because the roof slope was in the opposite direction, and I understood that if I went from left to right, I would face the issue of not being able to insert the last panel. Therefore, despite the instructions, I went in the opposite direction, from right to left. This simplified the task for me, and to be honest, I didn't notice any difference in the installation. Everything is inserted and fastened in the same way. At this point, I finished the main task, cladding the facade with panels. But the video doesn't end here because the little house is not yet complete. Next, I needed to finish the column. As you remember, it was made from 3 rough boards measuring 50 by 150. I can live with the small uneven gaps between the boards that resulted in some places. However, the various level differences and overall roughness need to be fixed. This can be done on site by sanding. Initially, we did this using an angle grinder or a sanding disc. Very dusty but quick and effective. After such sanding, imperfections remain because the flap disc is worse than a wood borer on wood, and the work needed to be done, very carefully. To make the surface even smoother, we then used a hook and loop sanding pad with sanding discs. And finally we painted the column with rubber paint. At first it seems somewhat reddish brown, but later, after drying, it becomes chocolate colored. But we still have the door. We also decided to put it loudly to restore it. Fortunately, the homemade sawhorses have come to the rescue once again. It was very convenient to work on them. At first we tried to remove the paint with a metal brush with twisted wire, but the process was very slow. Then we switched to a flap disc and the work went much faster. There were also a couple of unnecessary holes in the door, one from the old lock and another from the peephole. We welded and sanded both of them. By the way, we had to sand the frame right on the spot. I expected it to be more difficult, but no, it was quite feasible to do it without removing it from the opening. In general, I planned not only to paint it but also to insulate it and properly panel the reverse side. But I wanted to give it a finished look, so for now, I only focused on the exterior side. We still have the lower side part above this mini terrace, if you can call it that, not paneled yet. We decided to lay a cable with a corrugated pipe here to set up lighting in the future. As I mentioned, there is no electricity here, but we plan to create a hybrid solar wind power station. Subscribe. I will be showing all of this in my videos. Then we covered all of this. First, we made an L-shaped box to size, and then attached a plank to the side. It was impossible to fit a U-shaped one right away. We also cut and covered a piece of OSB right up to the corner. I degreased the metal door, and now all that's left is to paint everything. By the way, I've already installed the slope with a trim here. Since the process here is exactly the same as with the windows, and a separate video will be dedicated to them, I didn't show everything in one video. If it's ready by the time you're watching, the link will be in the description below. We painted everything with the same rubber paint. It is suitable not only for wood but also for metal. If you use the same one, be sure to read the instructions on how and what needs to be done. And here's what I ended up with. The windows, as you can see, I made from OSB. In my opinion, it's a great budget solution. And considering that they are painted in the same color as the other parts, they look just as cool. The most important thing is that if you need to replace them, it's a very cheap solution. You only need about half a sheet for all the slopes and trims. With the start of the new season, I will also work on the interior finishing of the house.